Okay. Ooh. Welcome. We are really honored to be welcoming you here today at the Wagner School Public Service. We are doing a book talk that's co-hosted between the NYU Furman Center and Elysium Between Two Continents. We're really celebrating a wonderful book written by Maria Foscarinis called And Housing for All, The Fight to End Homelessness in America. We are thrilled because of the timeliness of this topic, the expertise of Maria and the person who will be interviewing her, Steve Banks, who ran the city's Department of Social Services for a number of years. And the Legal Aid Society as well. So we get the balance of national expertise as well as hyper-local expertise. And the way Maria has written the book involves deeply rich narrative around lived experience of people. So it's a terrific honor to have you all. I can see a number of people in this room that have made direct impact both on New York City's housing policy and the way we house people who are unsheltered and experiencing homelessness. So it's an honor to be standing up here and getting to introduce the trajectory of today. I'm now going to hand this over to Michael Lahr, who's the artistic director at Elysium Between Two Continents. But on behalf of the Furman Center, welcome. We look forward to today's discussion. There will be time to ask audience questions in the form of note cards, so please feel free to get those in. So welcome, and I'll hand it over to Michael.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I'm Michael Lahr, Artistic Director of Elysium Between Two Continents, and I'm very happy that Elysium today has the chance to work and join forces with NYU Furman Center to present the book of my very good friend, Maria Foscarinis. Elysium is a transatlantic cultural exchange organization operating between New York and Berlin, and we use the arts, particularly music, theater, literature, to build bridges of understanding, bridges of exchange and dialogue, and to fight against hate, racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination. But at the beginning, 40-some years ago, we started as a theater company in the East Village, not far from here. And one of our signature programs back then was Theater for the Homeless. Every Monday, when the theater had a dark night, we would go to Tompkins Square, hand out 40 tickets, and invite homeless people to come to the theater. They could take a shower, they got a hot meal, and then they saw a show. The idea behind this program was to restore human dignity to the homeless, which is so often denied them. Maria has been in this fight for many years, since the mid-1980s, and I'm very glad and grateful that she will share some experiences of her long work with us now. Thank you.
So I also want to welcome our Zoom audience. We have about 25 people on Zoom. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Banks and Maria Foscarinis.
Or our age either, I want to just say. Or our age. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let me just say that this is going to be a great conversation. I told this to Maria last week. When I was in college, I had a professor, and we didn't have final exams. It was oral exams, and you'd come in, and the first question he would say was, did you read the book? And the second question would be, did you enjoy the book? And you knew those were going to be the two questions. So be ready, because we might ask you a few questions too. So we're going to talk, mostly Maria. I'm just going to try to guide the conversation a little bit for about 50, 55 minutes. And then we're going to have questions for about a half hour. And then afterwards, there'll be a book signing, and please stay and get the book. but of course everybody's read it, but you could get an autograph book to go with the one you already read. Maria really needs no introduction, but I would just say she and I have known each other a few years, and she's just played a groundbreaking role over the last several decades in really advancing the rights of people without any housing. There is a very long resume I could go through, but I would love on my own epitaph to say advancing the rights of people without housing. So that is certainly the way I think of you.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's an honor to hear you say that.
Are you ready?
I'm ready, I
Okay.
think.
So let's go back to the 1980s, a period of time which we both vaguely remember. You meet the Costers.
Yes.
Tell us about it. Like, how did you get there? How did you pick them? Like, who are they? And what does it tell us about where we are now?
So this actually is how I got involved in advocacy on homelessness to begin with. So the Costers were a family who had been denied emergency shelter. They lived on Long Island, which I always knew. I grew up in New York. I knew it as an affluent suburb of New York City, and not a place I associated with homelessness or even poverty. I was at the time a young associate, very young, at Sullivan and Cromwell here in New York, doing corporate litigation. And a memo came around saying, there's a case, who wants to volunteer? I volunteered for it. So the Costers were the named plaintiffs in a class action lawsuit that had been initiated by the Coalition for the Homeless here in New York City. And it was a case, it was a class action, so the Costers were one family in this suburban community who had lost their home. And what happened is that, they had been living there, they'd been renting a house with their children. The father had been working, he lost his job, he was on disability. They had to leave their home because the landlord wanted it for his own use. They left. In the meantime, housing prices had shot up. They couldn't find another place they could afford on the father's disability income. So, they really looked. They went from place to place. They could find nothing. Finally, they went to social services. They got turned away for emergency shelter. So this was the basis of the lawsuit, that these families and many others like them were in need. Housing had skyrocketed in this suburban community, and they had become homeless. And it turned out, I learned later, that this was emblematic of the crisis as it was beginning to explode across the country. It was families becoming homeless. It was people in suburban communities. It was not limited anymore to single individuals, to men, to skid rows of major urban areas. There were families becoming homeless. There were in suburbs all over the country. And so that was my entry into this issue. I worked on that case for a couple of years. And then after that, I left the firm to go to Washington to work on this issue at the national level because it was clearly a national crisis at that point. This was the beginning of homelessness. In the early and mid 80s was the beginning of when homelessness became a national crisis in this country.
So throughout the book, you describe the circumstances of families like the Costers and then single adults as well, in really sort of painting a picture about how people's lives were lived and what it meant to not have a roof over their heads. Now, I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer. Generally speaking, lawyers write in this kind of musty old way that doesn't have a lot of emotion baked into it. Where'd you get that writing style from?
Well, I tried not to write in a musty way. I wanted to write for a general audience, not for a specialized audience, because part of my goal in writing the book was in trying to get the word out about what, how did homelessness happen? What is driving it? What are the policies, deliberate policies that have led to this state of affairs that we're now in? And what can we do about it? But I also wanted to tell these stories because over my many decades of work on this issue, I've met a lot of people, either through representing them with, or advocating with them, or having, in various ways, I've met them and heard their stories. And I wanted to tell those stories. It's very important that the voices of people who have experienced homelessness be heard and be recorded. And the book includes just a fraction of those stories. But so I wanted to do that. I mean, the book is about the policies, but it's also about the narratives. And I wanted to hear the story, to tell the stories of people in their own words and their own experiences, and also reflect on how the sort of common narratives that get told in this country about homelessness are really destructive. And that's a running theme throughout the book.
Now, with the holiday coming up, Thanksgiving, I don't know if you've had this experience, but someone says, please pass me the food. And then they said, by the way, what do you do? And if you talk too long, they turn around to the other person because they actually don't want to hear about what you actually do.
Yeah.
So how do you explain to somebody the book in that small moment where they're asking you to please pass the turkey?
Well, I don't eat turkey, so that's.
All right, the carrots then.
So the book is about the evolution of homelessness in America. How did it come to be the crisis that it is today? How deliberate policies led us to this point, and how those policies were supported by destructive narratives that made it okay to pass and implement and support those policies, and how the impact on the lives of real people. So that's what the book is about. Now, pass the carrots. I mean, that is, in short, what it's about. And I guess the part I left out is that the book also makes an argument for housing as a human right. I mean, throughout the book, I argue that, in this country, we don't recognize housing as a human right, even though it is. It's international human rights law recognizes housing and other social and economic rights as rights and takes them seriously. In this country, we do not. In this country, we have this philosophy of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or let the free market do it all, even though the free market doesn't really exist. But there's this myth of the free market. Anyone who is in need, that's their own fault. And this is a narrative that has been applied to homelessness really since the very beginning. Ronald Reagan famously said homelessness is a lifestyle choice. And, people are homeless because they choose to be homeless. Suddenly people woke up one day and decided they'd rather live on the street. No, that's false, but that is the myth. And so if people are homeless because of their own fault, then no one has to do anything. It's their problem. And so that was the prevailing narrative at the beginning of this crisis. It's their own fault. Also, it's not an issue for the federal government or government at all even. It's an issue for charity. Maybe a little bit local government, but certainly not the federal government. So that was the prevailing narrative. That meant the federal government had no responsibility, even though it was clearly a national crisis. So that's sort of where I begin in the book. That is kind of where I began in my career in advocacy on this issue with, federal government. And that's actually why that was the whole idea of going to Washington. In the first place, I went to Washington originally while I was I left the firm. I went to Washington to start a national office for the National Coalition for the Homeless, which was then based in New York City, and wanted to have a presence in Washington because this was clearly an issue beyond New York City. It was clearly a national problem. And so logically, you know, as I learned in law school all those years ago, if you have a national problem, you know, you might think the federal government would do something about it. You can certainly make that case. So I went to Washington, and that was sort of my mandate to get the federal government to do something. And when you have this narrative that this is not an issue for the federal government or for government at all, that makes it very challenging. And that was what I was literally told at first when I started knocking on doors and trying to get federal legislation introduced. This is not an issue for us. So eventually that changed and it became seen as an issue, and we eventually got federal legislation passed. That was the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, the first federal legislation, and still only federal legislation specifically addressing homelessness, really. But it was very difficult to get that enacted, and it was also very insufficient on its own terms.
One of the things you excavate in the book is the fact that if you have enough resources to own your own home, you have the right to federal housing assistance in the form of the mortgage deduction. But if you don't have enough resources to have your own home, you're not entitled to any federal housing assistance. How did that come to be? And isn't that sort of at the heart of what the federal response problem is?
Right, that's exactly right. If you have a home, you're entitled to federal assistance in the form of a deduction, mortgage interest deduction. That's an entitlement. Entitlement means that if you are eligible, if you meet the criteria, you get the benefit. That is what an entitlement means. That applies to homeowners. For everybody else, if you're poor and you're trying to get housing, there is a federal program, the so-called Section 8 programs, or Housing Choice Voucher. They changed the name, but the Housing Voucher Program, which you could be eligible for, but you're not entitled to get it. It's a limited program. So even if you're poor enough to be eligible for assistance, only 1 in 4 of those who are poor enough to be eligible for assistance actually receives this help. Right now, it may, those numbers may get worse, but right now it's 1 in 4. So there's no entitlement if you are poor and you're in need of housing. And that's a key difference.
So you describe in the book banging on a lot of doors in the Congress. What's the response when you highlight that sort of fundamental broken piece of the federal response to housing?
So initially I knocked on a lot of doors, and I, of course, started with what I thought would be our most receptive audience, liberal Democrats from the Upper West Side. And like the most, favorable target group. And the response I would get was, well, it's really great you're doing this. We're so happy, but that you're pursuing this, but we have an election coming and we can't support you. Sorry. Eventually, persistence is key to a lot of things, but especially to this. And so eventually there was one person who eventually responded. That was Mickey Leland, who was in Congress at the time. And how, what happens with Congress is, I think this is probably still true. If you get one person, then second person slightly easier to get, and then eventually you get enough so you can introduce legislation. So we were able to get this legislation introduced. At the time, this was a much more comprehensive piece of legislation than what it eventually got enacted. It was a three-part piece. It was emergency relief, preventative measures, and long-term solutions. What ended up becoming the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act was part one, emergency relief. Primarily funding for emergency shelters, not exclusively. There were some other things in there, like the right of homeless children to go to school, which is very important. But it was primarily funding for emergency shelter relief. And, you know, that's the part that we were, and that was very, very hard to get through, to get enacted. And it was totally insufficient because emergency relief is exactly that. It doesn't solve the problem. It just provides some emergency aid. So it's like a Band-Aid. And, you know, Congress at the time said, well, this is just a first step. We're going to come back and do the rest of it, but they didn't. And so, you know, the gap that means that only 1 in 4 people get housing assistance has never been filled. That's a gap that came about early on thanks to President Reagan. So Reagan campaigned on a promise to shrink the federal government. That was his mandate. He promised to make America great. That was the original Make America Great promise. Okay, this was before again was added to that. So make America great, shrink the federal government. The scariest 9 words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That's what Reagan said. So we've got to shrink it. How are we going to shrink it? Cut programs, cut funding for anything that helps poor people or lower income people. And housing took a huge hit. So this gap was created. That's been an enormous gap that's never been filled. And then in 1987, we got this federal legislation enacted, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, that provided money for shelter. And not even, you know, so that there's no way that that can fill that gap. And there wasn't even enough money just for shelter, just to meet the emergency need. So even on its own terms, it was insufficient, and certainly emergency responses don't solve problems.
So one of the pieces towards the end of the book is you focus on other countries and what are they doing different? So can you get into that in terms of some potential models in other countries?
Yes, it's very important to realize that, so other countries have different approaches. One notable approach is in Finland. So Finland has virtually solved homelessness, has solved homelessness for families and virtually solved it for homeless individuals. But Finland, first of all, has a right to housing in its constitution. And it also takes that right seriously by funding housing and subsidizing housing for people who can't afford it, and subsidizing other social welfare programs like childcare, like healthcare. So all the things that people need to survive, that we all need. So that is a good example of how to do it differently. Vienna in Austria, so Austria does not have a right to housing in its constitution, and yet Vienna, the city, has a long-standing tradition of funding social housing. So social housing means, you know, it's somewhat like public housing, which now has gotten a very bad reputation in our country because it's been systematically defunded for decades and allowed to fall apart and deteriorate. But in Vienna, social housing is funded and supported, and it's not exclusively for poor people. A lot of different, it's mixed income housing, and it is supported and valued. That's the other key difference, that there's a national sentiment that values this, that doesn't look down on it, that doesn't see it as something bad. It embraces these programs. In Finland, you know, it's part of the national ethos, that this is how we do it. There isn't this narrative that if you need some kind of help, there's something wrong with you and you should be pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's a national ethos that values care and caring for each other. And so that is also part of what is different. Here we have kind of the opposite approach, where any kind of assistance is stigmatized, even though every single person gets some kind of assistance. I mean, I'm not just talking about the homeowner deduction, although that's the prime example of this, but everybody needs some kind of help. And yet somehow we single out people who are poor as, illegitimately needing and getting help.
It's a little ways off from the 2028 presidential election, but if you were approached by a candidate, which is not me, who wanted to run for president, what would you advise that person to put in their platform to finally end homelessness in the United States?
So an excellent way to end homelessness is by fully funding something called Housing First. So Housing First is a programmatic model. Housing First is a model that was actually pioneered here in New York City, and it's a model that is backed up by a lot of evidence that shows that it works. And what it does is it says that you end homelessness by offering housing first to people who are homeless. And then if people need other services, like people might need mental health services or substance abuse treatment or any, job training or any other services, you offer those as well. But housing has to come first, because none of these services will work in the absence of housing. You can't treat someone's mental illness. You can't help someone overcome substance abuse if they don't have a safe, stable, decent place to live. So that's the idea. It's a model that works. It has ended homelessness for many people, but it is not funded to scale. So the funds that are now available at the federal level are funds from this poor little McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which was not, funding has increased for that legislation over the decades, but it's nowhere near enough. And so now this is a program that, even though it works, is under attack by the current administration. One of the arguments is, well, you've had Housing First. Housing First actually became adopted as federal policy during the Obama administration, and the Biden administration continues to adopt it. But all of that meant is that these very minuscule, limited federal dollars you have to use them for Housing First programs. It didn't mean that we're going to fund it fully to scale to meet the size of the problem. It got a boost during the pandemic with increased funding, but that ended after. So you've got this program. Now the Trump administration, there, I said it, I didn't.
To Trump, don't worry.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that, but I said it. You've had this Housing First program, but people are still homeless. That means it doesn't work, which is, ridiculous, because it was never funded to scale. But now there's this whole campaign from the administration, aided and abetted by a private organization called the Cicero Institute, which is a very well-funded institute, the so-called public policy institute, with money from some wealthy tech billionaire. I forget his name. Someone probably knows it. But in any case, they are promoting this idea that Housing First doesn't work, and instead what you have to do is treatment first. People have to be subjected to treatment, and then, if they graduate from treatment, then they get housing. and, or be forcibly institutionalized. So, and also criminalized. So, and I guess we'll talk about criminalization later, but so that is the prevailing, policy and narrative. So I would say in 2028, when you're running, Steve, I would say implement, adopt, and fully fund the Housing First program. And that would go a long way to actually making housing a human right. That would make housing a human right if you were to do that.
Now, this could be either party or some third party, this hypothetical candidate. How would you help that person calculate the cost of implementing a right to housing in the United States, whether it's a combination of Housing First or an entitlement to Section 8, or however you're describing? In the book, you describe many different routes to get there, all of which gets there.
Right.
But how would you help that hypothetical candidate calculate the cost of it?
Well, it's good you mentioned the entitlement to housing, to Section 8 housing.
I just thought I'd sneak that in.
Yes, well, that's good because it was actually proposed by then President Biden in his Build Back Better proposal, which ended up being shot down thanks to Senator Manchin. But Biden did actually say, Biden and 4 other candidates at the time did actually say housing is a right, not a privilege, which was very important. It was something we pushed for. It was very important just to say that because it begins this conversation that helps get this idea out there and get it taken seriously. And he had put in Build Back Better that everybody who's entitled to Section 8 gets it. So that would have gone a long way, I think. It's not enough, and it still is subsidizing private market, but still it would have gone a long way, I think. But this got shot down, as we know. But how do you understand the costs? So one way to think about the cost is comparing the cost of this kind of funding to the cost of doing nothing. The cost of doing nothing, or the cost of a shelter, continuing with shelters, are more expensive. Shelters costs can often be more expensive than housing. Allowing people to simply live on the street is more expensive. What ends up happening is people don't have health insurance, don't have health care, end up using emergency rooms, which are incredibly expensive once health conditions get so severe that it's much more expensive to treat them. And then criminalization, using police to try to make homeless people less visible on the street, which is a huge trend and has been for decades and is growing worse by the moment. So all of those costs are real costs that are being borne by various branches of government and would not exist if people had a place to live.
I seem to remember former President Reagan saying, geez, I heard it cost $30,000 to put that family up in the Martinique. Wouldn't they be better off spending that money on a home? But he was just the president. He was only the president. So I know he couldn't really affect policy, apparently. But as we sort of move forward, you've talked about criminalization in many, it's sort of a theme through all of this. But where does that come from? If you go back, and maybe you can go back and sort of walk us through the dawn of modern mass homelessness and the sort of criminalization policies that arise in relation to that.
So by criminalization, we mean laws, the enactment and enforcement of laws that make it a crime to do things that if you don't have a home, you have to do in public. Like sleeping in public is the most obvious example. Laws that make it a crime to sleep in public places, even if you have no other place to be. So criminalization has a long history. in the modern context, it really started soon after homelessness became a crisis in the 80s and really started gathering momentum in the 90s, thanks to your former mayor here in New York. Your,
Not mine personally.
your personal former mayor, Rudy Giuliani, who made a big deal of criminalization, and he was started by pursuing the squeegee guys, as he called them, but it was sort of something that applied to everybody living in public. So making it a crime to sleep and live in public, and to ask for help, beg in public, all of that. It's been a trend that's gathered increasing steam over these decades and now has the official imprimatur of the Trump administration. It's a terrible trend. I mean, it means that you, and also the imprimatur of the Supreme Court, because there was a case just last year, a year and a half ago, in the Supreme Court that said, you know, it does not so it knocked down a primary argument that advocates had been using to challenge these laws, which is that they're cruel and unusual and violate the 8th Amendment to the US Constitution. Because what they do is they criminally punish people for sleeping outside, even in the absence of any other place to be. So, you know, if you have no place to be, there's not enough even shelter space, and you have to sleep somewhere because all human beings need to sleep. It's biologically impossible not to sleep. And you're punished for that. The argument was you're being punished for your status of being a person without a home. And that had been a successful argument in a number of cases. And that, I mean, that of course is an insufficient argument. What it does is it protects people from being criminally punished because they have no place to be. It doesn't provide a place for people to be because courts are constrained from ordering that in the absence of a right to housing. If we had a right to housing, courts could say, you, city, have to actually provide a place for this person to be. Instead, courts can only say you can't punish somebody for having no place to be. So that's a fundamental problem with our legal system. But in any case, there was this protection that was recognized by a number of courts. That was shot down thanks to the Supreme Court, and that unleashed, you know, hundreds of new laws enacted by cities around the country, making it a crime to sleep in public places. And now we've got the Trump administration sort of doubling down, saying, yes, you should pursue criminalization, you should round people up and, you know, put them in camps in remote parts of the city and just make them disappear. What's driving it may have been your question. I forget at this point, but I think you
You're doing great.
What's driving this? Well, no one likes to see people sleeping on the street. Of course not. It's terrible. No one wants to have people living in public places, living in parks, sleeping on sidewalks, under bridges, camped out. It's not something anyone wants in their city, least of all the people who are forced to survive this way. So the idea is, let's make this go away by making it a law against it. Well, that's not going to work because people have to be somewhere. And yet, instead of realizing that and realizing that the solution is housing so that people have a place to go, cities, it started as a city response, as city ordinances made it a crime to be outside, to live outside. States then followed. That's a more recent development, and the federal government now is pursuing this policy. Some states, like Gavin Newsom, I don't know if there's anyone here from California, but in California, Governor Gavin Newsom, for all his progressive rhetoric, hasn't championed a law that requires cities to have these kinds of policies in California. He knows there's not enough housing. He knows there's not enough shelter, and yet he's championing this law. This trend of criminalization is now something that has bipartisan support in many places. That, and the rhetoric now is also, has taken an odd turn where it's, let's not enable. If you're not passing these kinds of laws, not criminalizing people for being outside, you're enabling homelessness. It's really, you're helping people if you don't allow them to sleep in public, which is absolutely not true, because if help was available, people would be taking it, or if at least if appropriate help was available, they would be taking it. So that's sort of the story of criminalization in brief.
I seem to remember in the 1980s, there was an argument too that shelters caused homelessness. The more you had, there'd be more people who needed, went into
Right.
them, and that was what was producing homelessness.
Yes.
So you talked about the Grants Pass case, the U.S. Supreme Court case, saying that the federal Constitution doesn't prohibit criminalizing homelessness. Do you think a way that people should begin to address that is to look at state constitutions in the same way that the right to shelter in New York is a state constitutional right as opposed to a federal constitutional right?
Yes, absolutely, I do. I think that is where advocates should be looking, and I think are looking now, is at state constitutions, state laws. The Grants Pass case, that Supreme Court case, did not foreclose all arguments under the federal Constitution, just this one specific argument under an aspect of the Eighth Amendment. There's even, it even left open other Eighth Amendment challenges. But, with this Supreme Court, pursuing litigation in federal court may not be the wisest choice at this point. We certainly don't want any more pronouncements from this Supreme Court, or don't want to risk them. So state courts are a way to go in terms of litigation. There's also other kinds of advocacy. I mean, there are plenty of advocacy opportunities still. There's legislative opportunities. There's an example, very recent example in Seattle of advocacy that resulted in the creation of a social housing developer in Seattle, a city-level social housing developer. And, it was a multi-year process and a very broad-based advocacy campaign with a lot of outreach, grassroots organizing, education, that sort of started from a very negative position, initially started fighting criminalization in the city, and then built into, they won that battle, then they started fighting for housing, and were able to get enacted this social housing developer, the creation of the social housing developer at the city level, and just earlier this year, by ballot initiative, got that funded with almost 60% of the vote. So that makes me optimistic that it is possible at the local level, with a lot of public education, a lot of organizing, to actually get progressive, positive change.
Okay, it's not 2028, and we're not advising this hypothetical presidential candidate about how to solve the problem. If you had a list, I don't know, 3 or 4 things that you would really recommend that people do to meet the moment we're in right now, what would those be? And if you want to do 5 instead of 3 or 4, go for it.
Okay.
Or if you want to do 2, we'll still get full credit.
Okay, full credit, good. So I think the most important thing that people can do is inform yourselves about homelessness, about its causes, and be an advocate at whatever level. I think advocacy is critical, and be an advocate at, city level, at your local level, go to hearings, be a voice at the state level, at the federal level. Just, it makes a difference. Even at the federal level, it makes a difference when, members of Congress hear from their constituents about an issue. It makes a difference. They actually keep track of how many people they've heard from on particular issues. And there is legislation pending in Congress, even though Congress is not doing anything at the moment, but it will presumably at some point. There's something called the Housing Not Handcuffs Act. There's also the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign, which anybody interested in this should check out. It has its own website and you can sign up to endorse it. And the premise is exactly that. Don't criminalize, promote housing instead. But there's also, any number of advocacy efforts you can get involved in. Here in New York, there's the Coalition for the Homeless. There's the Urban Justice Center. We have its founder right here. There's a Legal Aid Society. There's any number of organizations to get involved with. And, these groups are active in advocacy before the city council, before the state legislature. There's a bill pending in the New York State legislature to create social housing in New York State. You can get behind that. So I think advocacy is the most important thing. That's not to say that direct service is not also important. A lot of people get involved, want to volunteer, to do something concrete, something hands-on. That's also important. That's a way to start learning, meeting people, get involved, learn about the different players who are working on this issue. So all of these things matter. Most important, I think, is advocacy.
Great. Matt reminded me that I failed in one area of my moderating here, or my questioning. I was supposed to remind you at the 30-minute mark, we'll be taking questions. Please write them down and provide them to the Furman team. Now I've left you only a few minutes to do that. So I apologize. I'm a better lawyer than I am a moderator. So speaking of lawyers, so you and I were beginning lawyers in the early 1980s. So what would you say to yourself then that you've learned over these years about how to do this work?
Good question. So
save towards the end because I wanted you to answer it.
So, right. So when I first started doing this work, when I first came to Washington to try to get the federal government to do something, I thought, I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up here. I thought I would go to DC, spend a year or two there, solve the problem, and come back to New York and do something else. And here I am, all these decades later, I'm still in DC. One thing I learned is that I don't think I was naive then. I think I didn't realize the extent of the problem and the strength of the interests that were driving it. And, the part that was not naive was that this is a solvable problem. Homelessness, mass homelessness does not have to exist in a country as wealthy as the United States. This is a problem that was created by policies, and it's driven and maintained by deliberate policies. And I did not realize at the time how difficult it would be and how much of a long-term investment in advocacy is needed to really solve it. So that's what I would say, and that I think is true, that it's a long term, and it's not, I don't take from that that I was somehow wrong in thinking I could solve it in a couple of years. I think that I was seeing it as a problem that is solvable, which is absolutely true, but it's going to take a lot more than I realized at the time. And it's going to take a lot of people and a big coalition of people to do that. You know, all these years later, I think that I remain optimistic. I think that there is the potential for a big coalition, especially as housing becomes increasingly unaffordable. More and more people are affected by the crisis in affordability of housing. And more people are seeing that, you know, they are not that far from losing their home and from housing precarity themselves. So that's how I look back on it.
If it's any consolation, in 1982, Marcella Silverman, who some of you know, and I were looking at pictures of Mrs. McCain's hotel room at the Martinique, and we said to ourselves, oh, if we work really hard for a couple of weekends, we can solve this.
Right, exactly. Same idea.
So what would you want people to take away from reading the book? Obviously optimism. I'm an optimist too, but what would you want them to, they've read the book, and what's your hope for what they take away from the book?
I hope the book makes people mad. I hope people get angry reading the book and seeing how, you know, the people in the book have struggled so hard and have worked so hard to try to improve their own situations, and yet they keep coming against these obstacles. And that these are obstacles that are created by other people, by deliberate policies that were put in place by our leaders in government, that they don't have to be, that there is a different way, and that it's going to take a lot of pressure on public officials to adopt different policies. I would like people to take away that housing really is a human right, and that what that means in practice is things like housing first, things like social housing. It's not something mysterious or scary. It doesn't mean that, you know, government has to build a house and give it away for free to everybody who needs it. It means that our government has to work in such a way that, and have policies that ensure that everybody has a safe, decent, affordable place to live. It means we don't live something so basic as housing, as a home, to the vagaries of the private market, which right now is dominating the housing market and is just out for profit. So it's housing as commodity, housing as financial interest, housing that is standing vacant right here in New York City because it's an investment vehicle. It's not something for people to live. So I'd like people to take a sense of outrage and a sense that, you know, we need to all do something to make a change, and change is possible.
Great. I think we're ready for the questions on that note. Oh my God, how am I supposed to read these? All right, I'm going to do my best. By the way, I'm a terrible writer, so I'm glad I'm not reading my own handwriting. Earlier in your presentation, you praised countries with social housing as having an ethos of caring, but aren't there populations, at least historically, more racially and economically homogeneous? How does the growing antipathy toward immigration change their commitment to social housing?
Okay, well, that's a good question, and it's a fair question, although it's a question that assumes that we can only care about people who are like us, which is kind of the premise underlying racism and fear of people who are different from us. And racism is real in this country and probably drives a lot of these narratives that I've been talking about. So it means overcoming some of that. It means overcoming some of these narratives about race. It means, you know, that's what having this type of, and I don't accept that the only way to have an ethos of caring is by having everybody be homogeneous. I think we can care, and we, in fact, in our own lives, we care about people who are different. And that's what it means to also have a pluralistic society. So what that tells me is that these are issues that are all interrelated. We have to work on all of these in order to be able to have that kind of ethos. And maybe it's more challenging in a country like this that is not only a country with a lot of different kinds of people, but also a country with a history of racism that's very deeply embedded. So it means more to overcome.
Okay, many of your proposed solutions, like Housing First or Housing Not Handcuffs, rely on a commitment to compassion and government assistance. But you also discuss the uniquely American bootstraps ethos. How can we go about changing that ethos to create a cultural window for Housing First and other interventions?
Oh, more hard questions. Okay.
You haven't even seen the other ones.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, but they're all good questions and valid ones. So how can we do this? Well, one way is to realize that this bootstraps myth is just that. It's a myth. No one makes it by their bootstraps. You know, we're all living in a community and who builds the roads? I mean, we all rely on things that are built by government. You know, people who are so-called no one is self-made. I mean, you're relying on the fact that there are roads, that there are traffic lights, that there are things that are built by collective effort, that, internet. I mean, all of these things are things that are built collectively and that are supported by government. And in this context of housing, the most direct example is the mortgage interest deduction. So education, informing people about this. I mean, people don't know this, they don't think about it. And so people just accept these myths as fact, that people are actually self-made, that the market is actually free. It's not. You know, market is regulated in so many ways. It's regulated in ways that benefit people who already have much more than they need. And we're talking about tax breaks for the ultra wealthy. What about that? Are those people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps? No, they're not. But we've got to, I mean, these are perspectives and facts that need to be more widely known. So I think education, public education, is a lot of that.
How can we build a political constituency in support of the right to housing? And do you see promise in the tenant movement in New York City, New York State?
Yes, I do. I think there are active tenants movements around the country, including in New York City, New York State, but also in places like Kansas and Colorado. I mean, there are growing movements. There's a movement to create tenants unions so that tenants are in a better position to advocate and negotiate with landlords. I think there's promise in that. I think the way to do this is by making common cause. And housing affects people across many different categories. And so making common cause on housing, the housing affects people in different communities and different across different issue areas. So I think it can be a unifying issue that brings people together. And tenants unions are just one way to do that, but that can be a powerful way. And tenants are coming together. Private equity is increasingly an owner of property, which is one thing that is driving up the cost of housing. And so organizing to fight that and to fight skyrocketing rents is a way to build support for the right to housing.
By the way, we're moving quickly through the questions, so if you have a question on a piece of paper that you've been afraid to provide to the Furman team, please do so now, or we will read them very slow, and that will get us there. The next question says, some percentage of persons experiencing street homelessness are unable to care for themselves, and when placed in quality supportive housing, return to the streets in a certain period of time. What's the appropriate government approach to this problem that's described in the question?
Well, some people do return to homelessness, even though most do not. And there, I think the response has to be continued outreach and continued support. I mean, there may be some, I don't want to posit that no one needs to ever be institutionalized. I won't say that, but that is, people who, we do have a process for that, people who are a danger to themselves or others. I assume that is what the question is getting at, might need to be institutionalized. That's not the preferred outcome. I think the idea is that, people who are offered care and with the appropriate level of support will be able to live successfully in some kind of permanent housing. But it may take several tries before it sticks, before the person is able to do this. And, the fact that there will be some cases where people do return to homelessness does not mean that that's not the right approach.
I could answer this next one too, but why
Okay.
don't you start with it?
Feel free.
No, you start.
Okay.
Has the right to shelter helped or hindered the effort to establish a right to housing? Be careful, they could cut you off depending on what your answer is.
Yes, okay. I have to be very careful here. I don't blame the right to shelter for there not being a right to housing. I think the right to shelter has been a good thing, even though it's had a tough time. I mean, it's really, the right to shelter is important. Shelter is a first step. It's not the solution. That's not its fault. I mean, it's not intended to be the solution. Shelter can be life-saving for people. Having a right to shelter is very important. Having a right that that is guaranteed, even though the various mayoral administrations have tried to undermine it. Most recently, the current administration has tried to undermine it or tried to repeal it. And it's only thanks to lawyers like Steve and his colleagues at Legal Aid going to court repeatedly to enforce it, that it still exists. And, you have this right and you have an administration committed to undermining it is hardly the ideal. Those are hardly the ideal circumstances for having this right do what it's supposed to do. It's not to say that it's at all perfect. I know that there are a lot of complaints about shelters and shelter conditions, and it's not housing. I don't think that that's why there's not a right to housing. I think that's why there needs to be advocacy for a right to housing. So we have this right to shelter. Let's go. We now know that shelter is not the solution. We never believed that shelter was the solution. We always knew, certainly advocates always knew shelter was not the solution, that housing was. But now we have a lot of evidence to back that up. So now we have this evidence. Let's go and try to make a right to housing. In the meantime, let's protect the right to shelter, because we're not going to do away with the right to shelter. It's not the solution. It's not intended to be. Let's keep that and get a right to housing.
Thank you. I agree with you. But if I could add to that, I think one of the things about this debate, housing versus shelter, sort of misses the context. There is no right to shelter in California, and you have tens of thousands of people on the street in Los Angeles, and also no right to housing. In New York City, you have, fortunately, the vast, vast majority of people experiencing homelessness either in shelter or doubled up, as opposed to on the streets. And it's just a different context. But there's a helpful model, I think, elsewhere that applies to why you need a right to shelter and a right to housing in the following way. If you look at healthcare, also a challenged area for people in need, but you'd never say, well, you don't need the emergency department. All you need is preventive medicine and sort of permanent health care. You need a combination. And the problem with the housing is that in New York City, the emergency department is out of whack because there's no permanent health care for people that need that support. And there's been a lot added in the prevention area locally in the last number of years, but if you look at the affordability crisis in the city and all across the country, that's why we have a lot of people in shelter in places where there is shelter, and that's why we have a lot of people in the streets in places where there is no right to shelter. So to me, it's really not either or. And if you go back to the early 80s, as I'm sure you did with the Koster family, they were saying to us as lawyers, I don't want to sleep in the street, help me. And so we did what we could to help the people in the situation. Okay, now to the next question. Did you have allies who inspire you? Sorry, religious beliefs, and how do you change public perceptions about who's experiencing homelessness?
Did I have religious beliefs that inspired me? No, actually, I don't have religious beliefs. Although I recognize that many people do, and that those beliefs inspire them. And many of the allies that I worked with over the years were motivated by religious beliefs. And that's not how I was raised, but I have great respect for people who are inspired and motivated by religious beliefs because they're acting on them, and they're taking them seriously, and they're putting them into practice. But that was not my motivation. My motivation had a different source. I grew up as a child of immigrants from Greece who had experienced the suffering and the devastation of the Nazi occupation of their country during World War II. And I grew up hearing every night at the dinner table stories about suffering and resistance also. And my parents talked almost nightly about this, and they talked about how people were starving and dying, literally dying of starvation on the streets in Athens. There was food in the countryside, abundant food, but it could not make it into Athens because of Nazi blockades. And this, it was very graphic. They talked about how every morning street sweepers would come and sweep the emaciated corpses of people from the streets. And this made a big impression on me. The idea that there was food available, and yet people were starving, literally starving to death. And, I grew up in a very privileged, relatively environment in New York City. I never suffered from starvation, certainly, or any really material need. But the idea that this could happen, and, I made the connection to, extreme poverty in our country, even though there's so much plenty. Poverty in the midst of plenty just really touches a deep chord for me, that it's just enraging. It's enraging that this could be, that people can be suffering and they don't need to be. And they're suffering because of the actions of their fellow human beings. So that's my motivation. It's not a religious one. It's something different.
If I could add to that, in your book, the description of the letter from the uncle that you never met, who was part of the resistance, I think is quite inspirational.
Yes, so I do include this in the introduction. That's also part of the motive. It's sort of like a motivation I didn't realize I had, because I discovered this letter later after I was already deep into this work. But I discovered after my parents died a letter from my mother's younger brother, who had been a member of the resistance. Greece had a very powerful resistance movement during the occupation, and my mother's brother, was, as a very young man, a member of that, and he was jailed and eventually executed by the Nazis. And he wrote letters from prison that my parents kept, and I found in among their things. And the last letter he wrote, so he was executed. The Nazis had reprisals. So if a certain number of Nazis had been killed by Greek partisan resistance fighters, then a much larger number of Greeks would be executed. And my uncle was among the first to be executed. And he knew that this was going to happen. The night before the planned execution, he wrote a letter from jail saying that he and his fellow inmates were proud and calm because they knew that they had done their duty, and that they called upon future generations to also do their duty. And so that really, that's just a very powerful testament. And I can only hope that I've done a tiny bit of what he asked. So that's the form my motivation takes.
Okay. Glad you spoke about that. This is a great next question. What do you wish you had put in the book, or what did you omit due to politics?
I'm not sure I omitted a whole lot due to politics. There was a lot I could have put in the book there, but I wanted to make the book be readable. That was the main. Certainly, there were a lot more stories that could have gone in the book. When I finished the book, it was before the November. So I finished the initial draft of the book that I submitted to my publisher before the November elections. So after the November elections, I had to go back, and I had an opportunity to go back and make some changes to the book, because I had ended it on quite a sort of high note and very optimistic note. And I had to go back and say, well, it looks like this is a struggle that's going to take a little bit longer than I thought. And here's, this, we had already talked about the first Trump administration, which was bad enough. And I, knew this was not going to be good. And so there's much more that needs to be done. So, as every day passes, there's more things that could be said, and there could be a long afterword still to be written, but that's a story for the future.
Okay. Isn't it a bit embarrassing for blue cities like New York City that red states have achieved much lower homelessness rates despite spending way less on affordable housing and social services? Everything seems secondary to the level of housing production. Can you unpack that question and see whether you agree with it, or you want me to say it again?
Right. Well, just the last thing, everything seems
seems
secondary.
secondary to the level of housing production.
Level of housing production, okay.
But unpack the
Yeah.
levels of homelessness in red states versus blue
Yeah.
cities.
Well, I don't know about the level in homelessness in red versus blue, and I would question that premise, first of all. For one thing, I question anything that's based on data on homelessness, because we really don't have good data on homelessness. The data that exists is, there's this so-called HUD point in time count that is extremely inadequate. That's sort of the federal government's official estimate of homelessness. And a lot of people make a lot out of it because it's the only thing that exists. And so people tend to like to crunch these numbers and then draw conclusions based on them. And that's really dangerous because the numbers themselves are very questionable. And the methods used, not to mention the definitions used, are really subject to a great deal of questions. So I don't know what this data is that says red states do a better job. I doubt that that's the case. I think the most consistent, and in terms of housing production, there are studies that link homelessness to the cost of housing. The cost of housing is the most important predictor of homelessness. Production of housing, I'm not sure what to say about that. I don't think that, there is an argument that, we're not producing enough housing, and that's what's driving homelessness. And that it's just, if there was more housing, the cost of housing would go down, and that would make housing more affordable. I don't really buy that. I think the country is producing housing, but it's not producing affordable housing. And there's a lot of, the country is producing luxury housing. If you look at New York City, there's a lot of luxury housing that's not even fully occupied, that's vacant. Because it's vacant for a reason. It's vacant because it's functioning as an investment, not as housing for people. So, it's not simply a question of housing production. It's a question of affordability of housing.
If I may, one piece of your skepticism about data is described in the book as follows, which is that the Department of Education considers a definition that's broader for homelessness than the housing and urban development definition. And so students in temporary housing are considered to be students that are either with their families in shelter or students with their families not in their own housing but doubled up, versus the definition that's used for the point in time count that HUD does, which is simply the numbers of people in shelter or on the streets.
Exactly.
So right there's a gap between the data.
Right, exactly. And the Department of Education number is much larger, although still undoubtedly an underestimate.
Right. And if you're in a jurisdiction where there is no shelter system, the number of people experiencing homelessness will be, that data will be depressed by the fact that there aren't people in shelters.
Exactly.
Okay, now that we did a little tutorial on data, let's go to a couple more questions.
Okay.
We have time for a few more questions, right? Okay. What about people who are leaving shelters and choosing to live on the streets as opposed to in shelters?
Well, living in a shelter is not a long-term solution. Shelters often have restrictions that make it hard to be there on a long-term basis. Like you can't leave your things there, therefore you have to carry them around all day. Or you have to be there at a certain time. There's a curfew. Maybe you have a job that requires you to work late past that curfew. Maybe you're going to school and you have to, you can't meet that curfew. So there's all kinds of reasons why people would not stay in a shelter longer than absolutely necessary. I mean, living on the street has many drawbacks, but it also has some degree of autonomy and possibly community if you're living on the street along with other people. So there are many reasons why people make a rational choice not to live in a shelter.
By the way, when you describe a shelter, rules could exist in, for example, not in New York City, but they would exist more generally, or they may exist in New York City and not in other places. It just really depends.
Right.
You're generalizing it.
Yes, I'm
Okay.
generalizing. It depends on the shelter. I mean, I was just talking to someone who grew up as a child in New York City in the shelter system. She's now a young adult, but she talked about how difficult it was to be a student and be in the shelter system and not be, and having to, this was in New York City, 10 o'clock curfew. If she had some kind of extracurricular activity or some get together with friends, she still had to be at the shelter at 10 o'clock. It was a hard way to grow up and to try to be a young person in the city.
This looks like a good summarizing question if we're at the last question, and you're going to love this lob. You ready?
Okay.
Could you please summarize the main causes of homelessness in the United States?
Okay. The lack of affordable housing. I mean, the main cause is that so how about this? This is something I didn't mention earlier, but in 1979, the federal government was funding over 300,000 new units of low-income housing each year. 1982, that number was down to under 3,000. This is the result of enormous cuts by the Reagan administration to funding for low-income housing programs. That's not even mentioning cuts to other things like other social welfare programs, like welfare for poor families, like other kinds of income supports, like Social Security disability benefits that were made impossible to actually claim and receive. All of these social welfare programs took enormous hits. So that's the main, and then the meantime, so that's 1981. In the meantime, there's been an enormous privatization of housing. The private market has begun to play has played an increasingly dominant role. Now we have private equity coming in. The banking industry has been deregulated. The housing finance industry has been deregulated. Now we've got the private market really driving housing. So the public aspect of housing has been emaciated. Private market has really driven the housing market, and costs have just risen without regard to anybody's ability to pay. So that's the summary of the cause of homelessness.
I think we're at time. Thank you very
Okay.
much.